So it presumes that you've talked to the underrepresented communities and you have their consent. And I think that's kind of the first step, is to talk with them about, do they want your organization to collect their materials, or do they just need support in some way? Is there advice you can give or technological resources you can provide that help them document their communities themselves? Because those things are different, and it kind of depends on each group or community that you're working with, or the relationships that you have between your organization and that community, what's going to make the most sense, whether you as the organization should be custodian of their information, or if they as the community themselves want to be custodians of that information. And then how you can support those choices. If there's ways that you can provide, scanners or people to help, or time to help with collecting materials, or just advice on, like, here's a program you can use, or here's the best kind of file folder to store your personal materials, and those kinds of things. One of the silver lining aspects of this 2020 time period that we're living in is how much history feels like it's happening right now, and the ability that we have to collect that history as it's happening, and that we know it's going to be important later. That's not always the case. You don't always know that events you're living through are going to be as impactful as they are. But right now we've got, major protesting going on. We have a global pandemic. We have huge climate change issues. So there's huge global national scale issues happening. And so we can look at collecting very carefully and say, we want to get as many perspectives as possible. And we can target in specific ways. So I know, like, a lot of archives have asked for people to give journals of their COVID-19 experience and what it's been like to be in quarantine, or what their feelings were when school shut down and things like that. And how each person contributes is different, but those calls have been very open and targeted in some ways to specific groups or populations that those archives serve. So, like, for Grand Valley, we asked very specifically for student perspectives. What was the student perspective at Grand Valley like? Which, in a lot of cases, for things like this, isn't something that we would have necessarily collected in the past. It may have just been, what was the administration's response, and then whatever made it into the student newspaper. And so this is a way to get at more direct firsthand experience right away. This is a classic question that gets asked to archivists, and I feel like I should have a pat answer by now, and I don't. So I'm going to say that this question, how I answer this question, depends on how you define interesting. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of different things I have found and really enjoyed. My very first position, one of the first collections I worked in, I unwrapped a crumpled up piece of newspaper and had a giant hairball fall out. And I was like, oh, well, that's weird. Finding clumps of hair isn't actually all that unusual in archives. Most archivists have a finding hair story because it was used in, like, Victorian jewelry, and there was, like, a trend at some point for these hair pieces. But as I kept working in that collection, I found 3 more separate clumps of hair. That was interesting. that was my first time thinking about, like, what do I do with this? Is it important to keep it? It's been saved this long, but I don't know whose it is. So there's a lot of questions that came out of the 3 separate clumps of hair. So that's one kind of interesting, and people who aren't archivists aren't as used to thinking about hair in collections. Another kind of interesting, I like to work with correspondence collections. So when I can read those really in depth, I find that to be really interesting. And there was one that I worked with, it was a World War II collection, and both sides of the correspondence were almost fully represented, which is very rare to have happen. And his side, he had been a translator who was stationed in Japan. And so it was Pacific theater, a kind of unusual job that he held, which made kind of the content he was able to share much more interesting, or not more interesting, but interesting in comparison to the fact that I just hadn't seen it before. And then her side, she had a newborn baby and was on her own in California. She'd moved away from her family to be closer to where he was stationed. And she was just very candid about her mental health, which wasn't something that I had seen in previous letter collections. And so that collection sticks with me as one of the most interesting I've ever read, for the details of her pregnancy, of having a baby during that time, of, again, careful of speculation, but of symptoms of things that I think we would now trigger kind of a postpartum depression conversation, and how she addressed that in her letters, and then how his work was addressed and how he was trying to support her through these issues. Just was all very fascinating. And then a piece that I didn't find, but that lives on my desk at work, is the affectionately termed moonshine jug. I can send you a picture of that. It is branded with the GVSC logo, our original logo from when we were Grand Valley State College. And it's just the kinds of things that we would, not we just Grand Valley, but we colleges in general, people in general, slapped logos on. I just find so fascinating. Like, there's such a wealth of those kinds of ephemeral pieces where they were like, oh yeah, put our logo on it, sell it, it'll be great. And I find those to be really fun finds.